The moment my son whispered those words, I knew something was wrong. "Don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." He said it quickly, barely moving his lips, as though he were afraid someone might hear. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they sounded. There was something about them that felt like a secret he was ashamed of, like I was a blemish on the perfect life he had carefully crafted. I didn't ask him why he said it. I didn't ask anything at all. I just smiled, polite as always, as if I hadn't heard the weight behind his words. Outside the window, I saw a man in golf shorts, watering his perfect lawn, his posture straight and confident, as though life had already written a story for him, one where people like me didn't have a place. I waved at him, not because I felt like it, but because that's what people in perfect neighborhoods do. They smile, they wave, they pretend they belong. And I, for the moment, was just another visitor. The house was pristine, like a showroom. I had flown all the way from Oregon to Connecticut to visit them after so many years of not seeing my son or his family. A long, tiresome flight, 2 planes, a bumpy taxi ride, a new place where I felt like an outsider already. I had brought a small suitcase, a few familiar clothes, and a tin of my homemade raspberry scones. Those scones, Daniel used to love them when he was a boy, a treat that would always bring him rushing into the kitchen with a big smile on his face. But now, those memories felt distant, as though I were reaching back through a thick fog to grab something that was no longer mine to hold. I was stiff from the journey, my knees aching with each step as I made my way into the house. But I didn't complain. I never have. Not when I worked double shifts at the clinic. Not when I paid for his college. Not when I sacrificed my own comfort for his needs. I simply followed him as he led me through the entryway. "Take your shoes off here, Mom," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Carla, his wife, appeared from the kitchen, holding a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. She greeted me with the kind of smile that never quite touched her eyes. "Marianne, welcome," she said, but her voice was distant, like someone speaking to a guest they weren't entirely sure they wanted. "We weren't sure which flight you were on," she added, her words like an afterthought. It didn't matter, of course. The message was clear. I was a guest, not family. The house was beautiful in that cold, curated way that modern homes are. Neutral colors, sharp corners, and everything in its place. No personal touches, no family photos, no sign that anyone had ever lived here, really. Just perfect. The kind of perfection I couldn't touch, couldn't penetrate. I looked around and saw that there wasn't even a place for my coat, so I held it in my hands awkwardly as Daniel led me to the guest room. "We'll show you to the guest room," he said, his voice polite, almost too polite. It was just a room, nothing more. No warmth in it, no space for me to feel like I was truly at home. Just a place to sleep. The room was clean, sparse, cold. The bed was made up with crisp white linens, and there was a small suitcase stand beside the bed, like a hotel room. On the nightstand sat a small card with the Wi-Fi password written on it. Nothing else. No personal touches. Just a note welcoming me, but not really welcoming me. Not in the way I had hoped, not in the way I remembered. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. My legs, stiff from the long flight, ached. But I didn't complain. Daniel hovered in the doorway for a moment, then said, "Just try to be relaxed tonight. It's mostly Carla's circle. You know, doctors, architects, that crowd. I nodded, though I didn't know what he meant. What did that crowd have to do with me? I wasn't one of them. I never had been. And yet, here I was, sitting in a guest room, feeling more like an outsider than ever before. He left the room without saying much else, and I was left alone in the sterile silence of the house, a house that felt like a museum of someone else's life. Not mine, not anymore. I stood by the window, watching the immaculate lawn outside, feeling like a stranger in a world that had moved on without me. As I looked out the window, I thought about the years that had passed since I had last seen my son. So many years of quiet distance, of not being needed, of not being asked to help, to be part of their lives. At one time, I had been central to their lives. I had raised Daniel, fed him, cared for him, been his world. But that was a long time ago. Now, I was just an inconvenient relic, a shadow in the background of their perfect lives. And I could feel it. I could feel how small they wanted me to be, how irrelevant, how unimportant. But I didn't say anything. I didn't complain. I didn't ask. I simply sat there, watching the perfect world they had built without me. And I let it wash over me. Later that evening, when Daniel came back to check on me, he gave me a quick, distracted smile. "You okay?" he asked, but I could tell he wasn't really asking. He was just being polite, like the whole thing was a formality. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what okay meant in this house. "I'm fine," I said. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he turned to go. "We'll be downstairs, just joining the neighborhood group for a while. You can relax here. Take it easy. It's all under control." And with that, he left. I was alone again, alone in a house that wasn't really mine, with people who didn't really see me. I looked around the room, trying to find something familiar, something that would make me feel less like a stranger. But there was nothing. No pictures, no mementos, no traces of my presence. Just cold, clean lines. I wondered if I had ever really belonged in their world, or if I had just been a placeholder. Something to be tucked away when not needed, like a piece of furniture or a seasonal decoration. I thought about the raspberry scones I had made, the ones that had once brought Daniel running into the kitchen with a smile on his face, and I realized with a deep, aching sadness that those days were long gone. Now, I was just an inconvenience, a part of the past that didn't fit into the picture they were trying to create. That night, as I lay in the guest bed, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. I thought about how my life had come to this, how I had sacrificed everything for them, for my family. And now I was here, in this guest room, in a house that wasn't really mine, with people who didn't really need me. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered, like shadows in the corners of my mind. I had spent my life living for others, giving everything I had, and now it seemed like there was nothing left. I wasn't even sure where I fit anymore, but I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the morning to come, not knowing what it would bring. And in the stillness, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way to matter again, not to them, but to myself. It was time to stop being invisible. The moment I received confirmation from the immigration officer, everything shifted. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. It was intentional. That first stab of realization that I had been abandoned, that my son and his family had left me behind without a second thought, it crushed me in ways I couldn't quite describe. The officer had looked at me with a mixture of respect and pity. He had made a small, polite gesture as if to say, "It's not right, but it's the law." My son, the man I had raised, the one I had given everything to, had arranged it all. And now here I was, facing a truth so bitter I couldn't breathe. The officer had looked at me when I presented my passport and said, "Ma'am, I'm afraid your family has already boarded the flight." His voice had been kind, professional even, but something about it felt almost too kind. Like a careful lie, the words hung in the air as if they were a threat wrapped in bureaucracy, the indifference of a system that didn't care about the human heart behind the application, the human that had once been everything to the people who now turned their backs on me. They had gone ahead without me. I wasn't supposed to be left behind. I wasn't supposed to be irrelevant. And yet, there I was, staring at an empty boarding gate, surrounded by the cold flicker of fluorescent lights and the hum of a world that kept turning, indifferent to my existence. I stood in the terminal, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It wasn't like a storm suddenly rushing in. It was more like a quiet sinking, a realization that crept in slowly, as if the world itself was crumbling beneath my feet, and I was too slow to stop it. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. Instead, I walked to a quiet corner as far away from the busy crowd as I could get and sat down in a plastic chair. I didn't even take out my phone. I didn't want to be reminded of the empty messages that would certainly follow. I didn't want to think about the smiling faces of my grandchildren, faces I would never see again, or the phone calls that would never come. Not because they didn't want me to be there, but because they had decided I wasn't worth the effort. I looked at the terminal around me. People moved quickly, going about their business. Faces filled with urgency, phones pressed to ears, their lives more important than the one sitting by herself in the corner. I could feel the tears building up, but I swallowed them back. I would not cry. Not here. Not for them. The hours seemed to drag on. I watched as people came and went, some with their families, some alone, all of them moving in their own worlds, completely unaware of the woman in the corner, forgotten and abandoned. I could feel the slow burn of anger rising in me, but there was no one to direct it toward. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't the stranger's fault that my own flesh and blood had treated me like a burden, an afterthought. I had raised him. I had been his everything. But now I was just another inconvenience, another person to push aside when life got complicated, another person who no longer had a place in his world. How had I come to this? The airport felt like a surreal place now, a space I had never truly belonged to, but had hoped I could find a way to carve out a corner in. The time passed, and I felt myself grow colder, both physically and emotionally. I hadn't expected anything great out of this trip. I hadn't expected a grand reunion or warm, loving gestures. But this was something different. This was betrayal. The kind that leaves you hollow, empty, questioning everything. I had spent my life giving, sacrificing, teaching, loving, and now I realized it had meant nothing to them. I couldn't even remember the last time my son had asked how I was doing. Not really. He had stopped caring long ago, when it became more convenient to ignore me than to face the reality of what he owed me. The worst part was, I wasn't even angry at him. I was angry at myself. How had I let it get to this point? How had I allowed myself to be so small, so easily discarded? I thought about my own mother, how she had raised me, how she had fought for me. I thought about the sacrifices she had made, and how, in the end, I had done the same for my son. And now here I was, left behind, a forgotten relic in the background of someone else's perfect life. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. The plane had already left. I was stranded. I had no choice but to sit there, alone, in the sterile silence of the airport lounge, watching the world go on without me. I could feel the phone in my pocket vibrating, but I ignored it. I didn't want to hear their excuses. I didn't want to hear their apologies. I didn't need their pity. It was too late for that. I was done being pitied. I had raised a man who could abandon me so easily, and for that, there was no forgiveness. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be something more. There had to be a way for me to find my place again. Maybe not with them, but somewhere. I didn't know where, but I would find it. It was time for me to stop being invisible. By the time the evening rolled around, I had made my decision. I would go somewhere. Somewhere I didn't have to explain myself. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked to the counter. I didn't even think about it. I just knew that I couldn't stay here anymore. Not like this. Not in the shadow of a family that didn't even know I was missing. I asked the clerk for a one-way ticket to Portland. She looked at me with confusion, perhaps sensing that this was not the usual request, but she didn't ask any questions. She just typed away at her computer and handed me the ticket. I took it without hesitation. I didn't need to know why Portland. I just knew it was the farthest I could get from the place I had been abandoned. The clerk didn't say anything as she handed me the ticket, and I didn't thank her. I just walked away, a small sense of calm settling over me as I made my way to the gate. As I sat in the waiting area, waiting for the plane to board, I realized something that both comforted and scared me. I had no idea what would happen next. I had no plan. I had no destination, except that it would be somewhere where I didn't have to pretend anymore. Somewhere where I wouldn't have to carry the weight of my son's expectations, of his indifference. Somewhere I could be free to simply exist without being measured against someone else's perfect life. Somewhere I could breathe. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I had chosen for myself for the first time in years, and that made all the difference. The morning after I had bought my one-way ticket to Portland, I sat in the small, sterile airport terminal, trying to ignore the anxiety swirling in my chest. I had no plan, no solid direction, and yet there was a strange sense of relief. I didn't have to answer to anyone anymore. I didn't have to make excuses or pretend to be someone I wasn't. I was on my own, finally, in a way I hadn't been for decades. But as the reality of what I had done settled in, a new fear crept in. The fear of facing what lay ahead. I hadn't prepared for this. I hadn't prepared to be truly alone, not just physically, but in every sense. The weight of my decision was heavier than I had anticipated. The hours passed slowly, and by the time my plane finally boarded, I felt like I was already walking through another life, a different version of myself, one that didn't belong in the same world I had known for so long. The flight was uneventful, and as the plane touched down in Portland, I felt a curious mixture of excitement and dread. Portland was a city I had visited in my younger years, a place where I had lived for a time, where memories of a life long gone still lingered in the streets, in the air, in the distant hum of the city itself. I remembered the days when the world was full of possibility, when I had been young and free, before I had settled into the life of a mother, a wife, a caregiver. Now, as I stepped off the plane, I was a stranger to this place. I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing here, but I knew it was the only place where I could begin again. I wasn't just escaping the airport lounge anymore, not just escaping my son's indifference. I was escaping everything I had been for the past several decades. I found a modest motel near the airport and checked in. The room was small, sparse, but clean. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I could breathe in here in a way I hadn't been able to for years. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out of the small window at the dim streetlights below, I realized I hadn't thought beyond the moment of escape. I hadn't considered what would come after, what kind of life I would build now that I was free. And yet, in the quiet, in the loneliness of this unfamiliar place, I felt the first flicker of hope I had experienced in a long time. For the first time in years, I could feel my own pulse, my own rhythm, without the noise of my family's expectations drowning me out. The idea that I might matter to myself, that I could be someone beyond the labels they had given me, was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The next day, I ventured out into the city. The streets of Portland had changed since I had last lived here, but they still held the same quiet charm. I walked for hours, taking in the familiar sights, the old buildings that had witnessed my youth, the parks where I had once sat with my children, watching them play. I passed by coffee shops and bookstores, seeing snippets of lives unfolding in front of me. Lives that weren't mine, lives that didn't need me. The weight of the past felt lighter with every step I took, but the fear of the unknown still lingered like a shadow behind me. I didn't know anyone here anymore. I didn't have a place. And yet, there was something freeing about that. I wasn't anyone's mother, anyone's grandmother. I wasn't the woman they had abandoned, forgotten. I was just a person, standing in the middle of the world, unsure of where to go next. As the days passed, I slowly began to piece together the fragments of my new life. I found a small room to rent in a house with a woman named Joyce, a woman who didn't ask questions, who didn't need to know my story, who simply accepted me as I was. Her house smelled like lavender and fried onions, a strange but comforting mixture that made me feel, for the first time in a long while, like I belonged somewhere. Joyce was a quiet woman, with a sharp tongue and a dry sense of humor. She didn't ask why I had come to Portland or what had happened to my family, and I didn't offer explanations. We simply coexisted in the space we shared. The room I rented from her was small but cozy. There was a window that looked out over the street, a small desk and a bed covered in mismatched sheets. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. I didn't need anything else. I didn't need anyone else. But even in this quiet, I could feel the pull of my past. My family's absence echoed in every empty moment. I didn't have anyone to call, no one to check in with, no one to share my thoughts with. My son hadn't called, and I hadn't called him. I wasn't sure if I ever would. I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The anger I had felt in the airport had faded into something else, something deeper, more permanent. The betrayal wasn't just in what they had done to me. It was in how they had treated me, as if I were nothing more than a burden to be discarded when it was convenient. It wasn't just my son who had abandoned me. It was my entire family, the life I had built for them, the years I had spent giving everything I had, asking for nothing in return. I had raised my son with love and care, and in return, he had left me behind, as though I were a forgotten suitcase, something to be packed away when it no longer fit into his life. And I had let him. I had let them all push me aside. I had let them make me feel small, irrelevant. But I wasn't small anymore. Not here. Not in this house. Not in this city. After a few weeks of settling into my new routine, I found a small cafe near the house where I had rented a room. It was a quiet place with a few tables and a counter where people came and went. The cafe was run by a woman named Heather, who greeted me with a curt nod when I asked if they were hiring. I had no experience in coffee shops, but I had worked in kitchens before, and I knew how to make a cup of coffee. I wasn't looking for a job for the money. I was looking for a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to be part of something again. Heather didn't ask why I was looking for work. She didn't ask where I had come from. She simply handed me an apron and told me to start the next morning. The first day was harder than I had expected. The cafe was busy, and I was slow, clumsy even, as I tried to remember the names of drinks and the routine of the cafe. But something shifted in me as I poured coffee, as I served the customers, as I moved through the small space. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I wasn't just someone's grandmother. I was just a woman doing a job, a woman with a purpose, a woman who mattered. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was a small step, but it was a step away from the life I had left behind, a step toward something new, a step toward finding myself again. But even as I found this small piece of peace, I could feel the pull of the past, the unfinished business with my family. My son hadn't called. I hadn't expected him to. I didn't know if I wanted him to, but I couldn't help wondering if he had noticed my absence, if he had missed me at all. Would he come looking for me? Would he even care? The question lingered in my mind, a constant presence. But I didn't have the answers. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for something more important. I was looking for myself. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when I found the flyer at the corner store. It was small, taped to a bulletin board with several others, the faded edges of its paper curling slightly from the damp air. The words, "Room for Rent," were printed in bold, blocky letters, followed by a phone number and a description of the space that seemed too good to be true. Quiet lady wanted. Private room, shared kitchen, no drama. $400 a month. The simplicity of it caught my attention, more so than the price, which I could barely afford but had enough for. I took a photo of the number and tucked it into my pocket, deciding to call later. I hadn't made any real decisions about staying in Portland. I hadn't committed to anything, not to the people I had met, not even to the job at the cafe. I was still in that in-between place, hovering in the middle of a life I had started to build and the one I had left behind. But something about the flyer made me feel like it was time to make a decision. A private room, a no-nonsense living arrangement, a place where I could settle without questions. It felt like something I could control. The next day, after finishing my shift at the cafe, I dialed the number. The phone rang for a while before someone picked up. "Hello?" The voice was sharp, direct, a little raspy. "Hi," I said. "I'm calling about the room for rent." There was a long pause, then a low chuckle. "You sure about this?" she asked, as if I were a stranger in a way that was more than just a formality. "I'm 77, I replied, not bothering to explain anything further. "I'm clean, and I don't have any drama." She laughed again, this time without any humor, but more like a knowing sound. "Come by at 4 p.m. I'll show you the room. Bring cash for the first week." At 4 p.m., I stood in front of a faded blue house with peeling paint and an old wind chime hanging from the porch. It was the kind of house that had a history, not the kind you bought for show, but the kind that had lived through years of quiet conversations, forgotten holidays, and unspoken memories. I could smell the faint scent of lavender mixed with the sharp tang of something frying in the kitchen as I rang the doorbell. The woman who answered the door was shorter than I expected, with a cigarette dangling from the corner of her mouth, and a look that made it clear she was used to dealing with people who weren't sure of themselves. "You the old lady?" she asked, eyeing me from head to toe. "I suppose I am," I said. She stepped aside without saying anything, and I followed her into the house. The walls inside were stacked with books and magazines, the kind of clutter that spoke of someone who had lived a life filled with stories and things that meant something. I felt an odd comfort in the mess, as if this was a place where I wouldn't have to explain myself. She led me upstairs to a small room at the end of the hall. It was simple: a single bed with a worn comforter, a small desk, and a dresser that had seen better days. The window was wide, and the late afternoon sun poured in like it had been waiting for me. "It's not much, but it'll do," Joyce said, her voice low, her eyes appraising me. I looked around the room, taking in the faded curtains, the peeling paint on the windowsill, the way the dust settled gently on the floorboards. It was all so familiar to me, the kind of room I could have lived in when I was younger, before I had been weighed down by the responsibilities of family and obligation. "How much?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the sudden knot of uncertainty in my stomach. "400 a month," she replied, her eyes flicking to the pile of cash in my hand. "I don't take checks or credit. Cash only. First week up front, and you stay as long as you pay." I nodded, pulling the cash from my pocket and handing it to her. There was no need for any further discussion. I didn't need to know anything else. The room was simple, the price was fair, and for the first time in a long time, I could feel a tiny spark of hope. "Fine," I said, feeling the weight of the decision settle on me like the weight of a new coat that had finally been broken in. "I'll take it." Joyce nodded without much reaction, but I could see a flicker of something in her eyes, a kind of respect, or maybe it was just recognition. Recognition of something I had been denying for too long. That night, I unpacked my things in the small room, folding my clothes neatly, setting my books on the shelf, and placing my medications in the drawer of the nightstand. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I wasn't someone's problem anymore. I wasn't a mother or a grandmother or a caretaker. I was just me. A woman who had finally found a place to exist without explanation. The next morning I made coffee in the little machine on the nightstand and sat by the window, sipping slowly. The rain had stopped, and the streets below were quiet, still wet from the storm that had passed through. It felt different here. It felt like I could breathe again, like I could finally be myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me who I was or where I belonged. I wasn't waiting for permission. As I sat there, sipping the coffee, I thought about my son, about what had happened in the airport lounge. I thought about how easy it had been for him to let me go, to leave me behind. He hadn't even looked back, and maybe that was what hurt the most. Not the abandonment itself, but the indifference. The way he had treated me like I was nothing. Like I was disposable. I hadn't spoken to him since that day, and part of me wondered if I ever would again. But as I sat in that small room, with the rain falling gently outside, I realized that I wasn't sure I cared anymore. I wasn't sure I needed him or anyone else to define me. I had spent my whole life living for others, giving everything I had, and I had been left behind. But now I wasn't just a mother. I wasn't just a grandmother. I was me. And that was enough. The next few days passed quietly. I worked at the cafe, a place I had come to enjoy, despite the occasional awkwardness of being the oldest person working there. I didn't mind. I didn't mind the slow pace, the steady rhythm of serving coffee, of listening to the chatter of regulars. It was a kind of peace I hadn't known in a long time. I was just another person, another face in the crowd. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. But even in this small corner of the world, I couldn't escape the pull of the past. I couldn't escape the quiet ache of missing my grandchildren, my son, the family I had once thought I would always have. They had moved on without me, and I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to that life. But I wasn't sure I wanted to either. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the familiar sound of a phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was a text from my son. "Mom, where are you? We're all worried about you. Please call." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. It didn't matter anymore. I had made my choice. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of that decision settle comfortably around me, like an old coat that had finally found its place. The days following my decision to stay in Portland began to blur together in a strange, almost dreamlike way. I had settled into my new life with a kind of quiet resignation, learning to take each day as it came, without expecting anything grand or extraordinary. I worked at the cafe where I had become a familiar face, and I spent my evenings in the small, quiet room Joyce had rented me. The rain had turned the streets outside into a slick, reflective mirror of the sky, and there was a certain comfort in the routine I had built. I no longer needed to ask for permission, to explain myself to anyone, and that freedom, however small it seemed, was everything. For once, I didn't feel invisible. The simple act of showing up to work every day, of making coffee and serving it to strangers, felt like an accomplishment. I had reclaimed my sense of self, however fragile it was, and that was enough. I had built a life where I could exist for myself, where I didn't have to answer to anyone. But even in this calm, there were moments when the past would come rushing back. The empty space where my family should have been, the unanswered texts from my son, the absence of the grandchildren's voices. The reminder of what I had left behind was always lurking just out of sight, threatening to break through the quiet peace I had so carefully constructed. I had come to terms with the fact that my son would never understand why I had left. He had called, of course, when he realized I was gone. The first few calls were filled with the usual panic, the confusion. "Where are you?" he had asked. "What happened? We thought you were just in the bathroom." The lie was clear to me, but I didn't call him out on it. I didn't need to. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The last message he had left was colder, more formal. "This isn't funny, Mom. Come back." And that was the last time I heard from him. No apology, no understanding, just a demand. He had always treated me like I was there for convenience, as though my presence in his life was a background noise that could be turned on and off at will. And now I had chosen to turn it off. I didn't expect him to reach out again, at least not in any meaningful way. I had made my choice. But then, one afternoon, as I was walking home from the cafe, I noticed something unusual. A man in a gray windbreaker was standing at the corner, his posture stiff, his eyes scanning the street as if he were waiting for someone. As I drew closer, he looked up and saw me. He straightened up, and without a word, he walked towards me. For a moment, I thought he might be lost, someone looking for directions. But then he said my name. "Mrs. Harlow?" His voice was smooth, controlled, the kind of voice you hear on the other side of a desk. I stopped, startled, unsure of who he was or how he knew me. "Yes," I said, my heart suddenly racing. "Who are you?" He didn't immediately answer. He just handed me a business card. Derek Sorensen, attorney at law. The name meant nothing to me, but the card felt like a weight in my hand. "I represent your son and his wife, Adam and Lisa Harlow," he said, his voice calm, but with an undertone of something else. "They've asked me to speak with you regarding your well-being and your assets." The words hit me like a slap to the face. I wasn't prepared for this. I hadn't been prepared for any of it. The thought of my son sending someone like this, a lawyer, to find me, to check on my well-being as though I were some charity case, was infuriating. I could feel my blood begin to boil, but I kept my voice steady. "I don't need your help," I said, the words slipping out sharper than I intended. He didn't seem to be bothered by my tone. "It's not about help, Mrs. Harlow," he said. "It's about making sure you're taken care of." His eyes didn't leave mine as he spoke, and I could see the practiced indifference in his gaze. He didn't care about me, not really. He cared about what I represented, what I could still offer. "Your son is worried, Mrs. Harlow," he continued, his voice softening, like he was trying to make me feel something. "He wants to ensure you're in a safe environment." I laughed, a bitter, cold laugh that caught him off guard. "Safe?" I repeated, the word tasting foreign on my tongue. "I'm perfectly safe, thank you. Safe enough to make my own decisions, to live my own life. I don't need anyone to check on me." I could see his face twitch ever so slightly, as if my words had been a little too sharp for his comfort. But he didn't back down. Instead, he gave a tight smile, his expression almost apologetic in the way people act when they're not quite sure how to respond. "Of course, Mrs. Harlow," he said, "but perhaps we could talk about your situation. Your son wants to make sure everything is in order." I could feel the weight of the words settle on me, like an unwanted burden. My son, the man I had raised, the one who had walked away from me without a second thought, was now sending someone to make sure everything was in order. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "I don't want to talk to you," I said, my voice firm. "And I don't want to talk to him." He didn't argue. He just nodded, as if he had been expecting this response all along. "I understand," he said, his voice softening again. "But if you change your mind, you have my number." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the street like a ghost. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the spot where he had been, the card still clutched in my hand. I didn't know whether to throw it away or keep it, as some twisted reminder of everything I had left behind. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't matter. His visit, his words, none of it mattered. He was just a messenger, a pawn in a game I didn't want to play. But it was clear now. My son was not done with me. That night, I sat on the porch, the cool evening air biting at my skin, trying to make sense of everything. The sense of betrayal I had felt when I walked away from my family was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. But now, it was tinged with something else, something darker. I realized that I was never going to be free of them, not really. They were never going to let me go. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be let go. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that yearned for the family I had once had, the one that had felt warm and whole. But that family was gone, replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. They had moved on without me, and I had no place in their new world. And I realized finally that I had no place in the world they had built for me, the world of expectations, of sacrifice without acknowledgement. But it didn't matter. I didn't need them anymore. I had come this far, and I would keep going. For the first time in my life, I was not waiting for someone else to decide my worth. I wasn't waiting for anyone to come and save me. I was saving myself. The next day, Joyce asked if I had heard from anyone. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to tell her what had happened. I didn't want to explain the intrusion of my past into my present life. But she could see it in my face, in the way I held myself, the tension in my shoulders. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Yeah," I said, finally letting out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. "I'm fine." She didn't press. She never did. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I was reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. My freedom, my voice, my right to exist for myself. It didn't matter what they did or what they tried to force on me. I was stronger than I had ever known. And that was the most powerful thing of all. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand, a sharp, insistent buzz that broke the quiet of the room. I didn't need to look at it to know who it was. I had stopped checking his messages long ago, but something about the urgency of the vibration made me reach for it. As my fingers brushed the screen, I saw the familiar name, Adam. I had stopped answering his calls, stopped responding to his texts, but this one felt different. I opened the message without hesitation, as if the phone itself had been waiting for me to make this decision. "Mom, I don't know what's going on. This isn't funny. I've called, I've left messages, I don't know where you are. Please, just call me back." The words hit me harder than I expected, like a physical punch to the chest. I stared at the screen, not sure if I should respond, if I even wanted to. The coldness in his voice still stung, even through the written words. It was as though he thought he was entitled to me, entitled to my presence in his life, no questions asked. He hadn't asked how I was doing. He hadn't once tried to understand why I had left. His only concern was for himself, for the inconvenience I had caused by stepping away from a life I had no place in anymore. I set the phone down without responding. My heart was still racing, but there was something else, something that felt strangely calm. I realized that for all the years I had spent trying to be everything to everyone, trying to be what they needed me to be, I had never stopped to ask myself what I needed. What did I want? What did I need to feel whole again? The answer had come to me over the past few months, in bits and pieces, like a puzzle slowly coming together. I needed to stop being an afterthought, a placeholder in their lives. I needed to stop being someone's convenience, their backup, their fallback. I had spent so many years in the background, keeping everything together for everyone else. But now I realized that I deserved something more. I deserved a life where I didn't have to apologize for my existence, a life where I could be someone outside of the roles they had defined for me. I didn't need their permission anymore. I didn't need their approval. I had spent my whole life being the person everyone else expected me to be, and it had never been enough. Not for them, and certainly not for me. I had given everything to them, my time, my energy, my love, and it was never enough. I had always been the one who made sacrifices, the one who gave without asking for anything in return, and now I was left with nothing but the pieces of a life that had never truly been mine. I had let myself be used, forgotten, discarded. But that was over now. I had a chance to reclaim something for myself, to finally be the person I had always wanted to be, without anyone telling me what I could or couldn't do. And that was exactly what I was going to do. I stood up, walking to the small window of my room, looking out at the quiet street below. The world outside was still, the sky a soft gray as the morning light began to break through the clouds. The rain had stopped, and the streets were wet, glistening in the early light. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight of the past, of my son's expectations, of the family I had left behind, seemed to fall away in that moment, like an old coat that no longer fit. It didn't matter anymore. They could try to pull me back, to guilt me into returning, to manipulate me with their concern. But I wasn't going back. I had moved on. I had found a life for myself, one that didn't require their approval or their validation. As I stood there, looking out at the city, I thought about what my son had said in his last message. This isn't funny. He had said it like I was playing some kind of game, like this was a joke to me. But it wasn't a joke. This was my life, my decision, my choice. And I was finally choosing to live it for myself. I had spent so many years putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. But now I was finally putting myself first. It was a strange, almost foreign feeling, but it felt right. I wasn't doing this out of anger or spite. I wasn't running away from my family. I was running towards something else, something better, something that was mine. The phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say. Another message from Adam. Another attempt to manipulate me, to pull me back into his world. But I didn't belong there anymore. I had made my choice, and I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel guilty for it. The life I had lived with them had been filled with love, yes, but it had also been filled with resentment, with unspoken expectations, with sacrifices that were never acknowledged. I had spent my whole life being what they needed me to be, and now it was time to be what I needed to be. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own life, over my own choices. I had built something here in Portland, something real. I had a job I liked, a place to stay, and I had started to meet people who saw me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. Joyce had become someone I could rely on, a person who didn't expect anything from me except that I be myself. And the cafe, with its quiet mornings and regular customers, had become a place where I could just be. I wasn't anyone's mother or grandmother or burden. I was just another woman, doing her best, living her life. And that was enough. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. I wasn't going to give it up. I thought about the last time I had spoken to my son. He had asked me to come back, to stop punishing him, to forgive him. But he didn't understand. He didn't understand that I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was just trying to live for myself, to finally make a life that wasn't defined by his expectations. And it wasn't that I didn't love him. I did. I always had. But I had spent so many years giving, so many years being everything he wanted me to be, that I had forgotten how to be myself. And now I was learning. I was learning to be someone who didn't have to answer to anyone, who didn't have to explain herself, who could finally make decisions that were just for her. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. I wasn't bitter. But I was done waiting for them to see me, to acknowledge me, to care. I didn't need them anymore. I had learned to stand on my own, to be independent, to make my own choices. And as I stood there, looking out at the quiet streets of Portland, I knew that I had made the right decision. I wasn't going back. Not for anyone. Not for my son. Not for my family. I was done being invisible. I was done being a shadow in their lives. I was finally living for myself. And that was all that mattered. The morning after I decided to ignore my son's message, everything felt different, as if the world had shifted just slightly on its axis, aligning in a way that made everything seem clearer. I woke up with a strange sense of peace, one that had eluded me for years. I could feel the cool morning air coming in through the window, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain and the promise of a new day. The weight that had settled over me when I first made the decision to leave had dissipated, replaced by something far lighter, a freedom that I hadn't realized I had been craving until it was finally here. It was strange, almost surreal, but as I moved through the motions of getting dressed and preparing a simple breakfast for myself, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I wasn't trying to please anyone. I wasn't running on autopilot, fulfilling some role I had been assigned. I was simply living. The world outside the small window of my room was quiet, the street still wet from the rain that had passed through overnight. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the soft chirping of birds that had settled in the trees nearby. It was an ordinary morning, and yet it felt extraordinary. I hadn't felt so awake, so fully alive in years. I went about my day in the same quiet way I had been for the past few months, working at the cafe, talking with Joyce, and making small connections with the people who came in for coffee. Nothing was particularly remarkable about the day, and yet it felt like a victory. Every interaction, every task, no matter how small, felt like a triumph of selfhood. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I wasn't a mother or a grandmother, not someone's past that they could sweep aside when they didn't need me. I was just me, Marianne Harlow, living my own life, free from the weight of everyone else's expectations. The quiet satisfaction that came with this realization lingered with me throughout the day, growing stronger as the hours passed. That evening, after work, I returned to the room Joyce had given me. The room itself had become more than just a place to sleep. It had become a sanctuary of sorts, a space where I could be alone with my thoughts, where I didn't have to explain myself or apologize for my presence. It was small, simple, but it was mine, and that was enough. I had learned to appreciate the little things in a way I never had before. The soft glow of the lamp beside the bed, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the comfort of knowing that for the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't pretending. I had stopped trying to be what other people wanted me to be. I was just existing, quietly and honestly. As I sat at the small desk by the window, reading a book that had been sitting on the shelf for months, I heard the faint buzz of my phone again. I had been ignoring the messages from my son, but something about the sound made me pause. I picked up the phone, my fingers hovering over the screen, before finally deciding to check it. Another message from Adam. I had expected this, of course, but I hadn't expected the tone to be different. This time, the message was shorter, less insistent, less demanding. It simply read, "I don't understand why you left, but I want to understand. I want to be there for you, Mom. Please let me know you're okay." There was no anger in his words, no guilt trip, no demands. Just a simple expression of concern. I stared at the message for a long time, my fingers still resting on the screen. It wasn't the message I had expected from him. It wasn't a plea for me to come back or to apologize for leaving. It was a request for understanding. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the first real connection I had felt from him in years. I sat there, looking at the message, my heart racing, my mind spinning with conflicting emotions. I had wanted him to reach out, to acknowledge the pain I had felt. But now that it was happening, I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. The anger I had felt toward him, toward my family, had begun to fade over the months. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it had softened, replaced by a kind of quiet acceptance. I had spent so many years being angry, being hurt. But now, in this moment, I realized that holding on to that anger was no longer serving me. It was holding me back from moving forward. I didn't need to forgive him. I didn't need to forgive anyone. But I also didn't need to keep carrying that weight. I didn't need to keep myself tethered to a past that was no longer mine. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over the keyboard as I typed my response. It was simple, almost too simple. I'm okay, Adam. I'm fine. I'm learning to live for myself now in my own way. I don't need you to fix anything. Just know that I'm okay. I wasn't sure if that was what he wanted to hear, but it was the truth. I wasn't asking for his understanding, and I wasn't ready to open up to him fully. But I was telling him, in my own way, that I was okay, that I had finally found a place for myself in the world, outside of the roles I had been given. I didn't need him to rescue me. I didn't need anyone to rescue me. I was rescuing myself. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a moment. The weight of everything that had happened, everything I had been through, began to lift from my shoulders. I had spent so many years living in the shadow of my family's expectations, of what they needed me to be, but now I was standing in the light of my own life, my own choices, my own freedom. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As I sat there, In the quiet of the room, I realized that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and moments of fear. But I also realized that I was no longer afraid of those things. I had learned to trust myself, to believe in my ability to navigate this new life on my own terms. And that was something I had never been able to do before. I had spent my whole life waiting for someone else to tell me what to do, to guide me, to validate me. But now, I was the one guiding myself. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. I didn't need anyone else's approval. I didn't need anyone else's permission. I was free, truly free, in a way that I had never imagined possible. And as I looked out the window at the city stretching out before me, I knew that I had made the right decision. I had chosen to live for myself, and that was the greatest gift I could have ever given myself.